people tend to be very firmly connected into either an abstinence or a harm reduction. And one of the things that, if you have an opportunity to listen to Destiny's work, is that there is even within the shelter system, particularly the shelter system in Hamilton, where she was working, you had people who were either on one side or the other in terms of harm reduction or abstinence. And I'm not sure if, Isaac, you experienced the same thing in working in a shelter system in Toronto, but often you are in one camp or another. So harm reduction is a model of health as social justice, and it's an acknowledging about the interlocking struggles against inequality and oppression as central to both health and liberation. And alongside of that is the combating of forms of racism and stigma and marginalization as part of that harm reduction. So we might think of harm reduction as something like a methadone clinic or a safe injection site, but harm reduction can also involve safe practices around sex work. It could involve also campaigns that reduce stigma or marginalization of groups as well. So it can involve education also. And it affirms the wisdom, dignity, and leadership of the people most directly affected by harms, such as the holders of the key to any kind of change. The first programs were controlled drinking programs in the 1980s in Toronto. And then you had things like syringe exchange programs in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. And then in the 1980s and 90s, methadone clinics opened in a number of provinces. And this was a harm reduction, and it continues to be, there continue to be methadone clinics that are moving people off of one drug and moving them onto methadone, which in terms of its theory is less addictive and has less harms. This is also where you see a rise of NIMBYism. Does anyone want to define what NIMBYism is? Has anyone heard that term before? So yeah, Suzanne.
It stands for not in my backyard, which means like you're theoretically okay with an intervention or a community support, but you want it to happen somewhere else.
Oh, yeah.
So you don't have to encounter it on a daily basis.
Right. And this is where you have angry citizens being involved in anti-harm reduction. So get that clinic out of, we don't want drug users in our community. We don't want this to happen. So it's fine, but there is definitely this real sense of they are not us. These people are not us. We don't want that type of person in our community. Yeah, Suzanne.
So I live in the town of Aurora, which is sort of near King City, Newmarket type of area.
Yeah.
We don't have a formalized shelter here. So we tend to export people who are unhoused to Richmond Hill or Newmarket or King City, bigger communities around us. And there has been a citizens advocate group, because don't get me wrong, it's not that we don't have unhoused humans here. That is incorrect. But we don't have any, our formal supports are very lacking. And there was a proposal in front of our town council to build a men's shelter. They had the grants, they had the land, they have everything ready to go. And the anger and vitriol that came from the other members of the community around not installing this shelter in our community was unbelievable. Aurora tends to be a fairly affluent community as well. And the pushback was, I was not prepared. I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but I was not prepared to see that level of anger and animosity towards people who, I mean, like, if you learn, like, learning and working with people that are unhoused, like, it can happen to people for lots of different reasons. It's not a moral failing to be unhoused, but it was very much that language as well. And that's that intersection, right, of being
Yeah.
housing insecure and addiction and stuff. It was those people, and that's going to bring in X, Y, and Z theoretical harm. But it was wild to watch that happen, like within this, like, otherwise, like, very boring community.
Yeah, people get, so this is definitely, thank you for sharing that, Suzanne. And when I was working in Regent Park um in the the first decade of the 2000s, there was, I mean, that was it wasn't Regent Park, but just below Regent Park, there were a couple of methadone clinics on King Street, but you had this affluence growing in the downtown east side, but closer to Harborfront, and you had a lot of angry people saying, we don't want this in our community. So like, you definitely see where people where that historic root of what is good and what is bad, or what is a moral failing of an individual, is definitely seen in resisting the placement of a shelter or a methadone clinic within a particular community. Also a halfway house. So anything that might bring you in relationship with people who are considered to be other, or to have a particular moral failing. Then our book, just in terms of looking at the state of emergency that's declared in the downtown east side, and you have a group of residents who are living in downtown east side in different rooming houses, old hotels, and you see this increase of HIV infections. And in fact, at one point in the 90s, there were more HIV cases in downtown East Vancouver, anywhere, like more cases in downtown East Vancouver than there were anywhere except for sub-Sahara Africa, in terms of HIV and AIDS. And so you had prevalence rates at around 25 to 35% of the population. And it was out of that initial state of emergency around HIV and AIDS that there was a move towards harm reduction. In Ontario, it looked a little bit different in that some of those principles of around harm reduction actually were incorporated into Ontario's approach. And so there was new comprehensive drug strategies that are developed, and harm reduction plays a role in that, and it plays a strong role in it. But it actually becomes part of, rather than being grassroots work, it becomes integrated into government systems that can be funded in different ways and can be unfunded in different ways as well. So as we look at the downtown east side in Vancouver, I highly recommend the website. You can click on this in the slide and look at the website that is here as well. So Downtown East Side in Vancouver, it's a great book. You can order it. You can also borrow it from me if you're interested in learning more than you got from those couple of chapters. And you see how initial community organizing leads to the emergence of a movement. So you have Bud Osborne and Ann Livingston, who are partners and both part of part of the community. And so people who have lived with addiction, and whose friends have lived with addiction, and see people that see friends and family, and losing them to addiction, to some of the impacts of addiction, to living rough in spaces of homelessness or being unhoused. One of the things that emerged out of that was the People's Aid Project. And back when I was in undergrad and university, I met Bud Osborne, and he was an incredible poet, and was kind of like a beat poet. Like he would also come and perform in Ontario, in Toronto, and I I encountered him at that point. At that point, he had been a part of establishing VANDU, which is the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users. There was funding for the health board, and for a time, Bud Osborne ran and joined the health board, trying to engage the system because he really felt like his voice didn't matter. And one of the quotes from Bud Osborne is, "I would have never in my life as a long junkie on the street have ever believed in a million years that a whole bunch of low bottom drug addicts from the worst places could come together as an organization and accomplish something." And that is exactly what they did. So to give a sense of you'll see on Quirkus that there's actually a link to the Vancouver Library, which has all of Bud Osborne's poetry. And I wanted to just actually play this small piece for you. And it is Oppenheimer Park is a park that is a central park in the downtown East Vancouver. And Bud Osborne is actually speaking to a campaign that they started to mark the deaths of their friends and community, to opium deaths. And so here is just a video done of him in Oppenheimer Park reciting one of his poems. And I'm just going to make sure, can you let me know if you can't hear it? I would have tested this before class if I had a laptop that was working. So let me just
1,000 crosses in
okay,
Oppenheimer
perfect.
Park. When eagles circle Oppenheimer Park, who see them feel awe, feel joy, feel hope soar in our hearts. The eagles are symbols for the courage in our spirits, for the fierce and piercing vision, for justice in our souls. The eagles bestow a blessing on our lives. But with these 1,000 crosses planted in Oppenheimer Park today, who really see them feel sorrow, feel loss, feel rage. Our hearts shed bitter tears. These 1,000 crosses are symbols of the social apartheid in our culture, the segregation of those who deserve to live and those who are abandoned to die. These 1,000 crosses silently announce a social curse on the lives of the poorest of the poor in the downtown East Side. They announce an assault on our community. These 1,000 crosses announce a deprivation of possibility for those of us who mourn here. The mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers, the uncles, aunts, grandmothers and grandfathers, the sons and daughters, the friends and acquaintances of those members of our community, of 1,000 dreams, of 1,000 hopes, of 1,000 yearnings for real community, lost to us, but memorialized today, brought finally into a unity here in this community park. This park, which is the geographical heart of the downtown east side. These 1,000 crosses are a protest against the abandonment of powerless and voiceless human beings. These 1,000 crosses speak to us resoundingly, collectively, to warn us that to abandon the wretched, the miserable, the scorned, the scapegoated makes a legitimate place for abandonment in our society. And this abandonment will go right up the social ladder. But to truly care for lives at the bottom will make a place for care. And this caring will ensure that no one be abandoned. These 1,000 crosses represent the overdose deaths of drug addicts, who are not the only drug addicts in our society, but only the most visible, the most naked, because the poorest. But these 1,000 crosses reveal a culture pretending to be about life and health and hope, but permeated with death and disease and despair. These 1,000 crosses bear witness not to a culture of care and freedom, but of carelessness and addiction. Any one of these 1,000 crosses could easily represent my own death. Doctors at St. Paul's Hospital asked me after an overdose why I was still alive. And that is a question each moment puts to us, a question each one of these 1,000 crosses puts to each of us. Why are we still alive? For what purpose? Our purpose is to live in community. And community is care, care for one another, care for those least able to care for themselves, care for all, care in action. And there is no one to care if you do not care. There is no one at all to care if I do not care. But it would be a betrayal of these 1,000 who have died to call them victims, to victimize them in death, because in truth they are martyrs. These 1,000 crosses symbolize the lives and deaths of 1,000 martyrs. The word martyr means one who bears witness, one who suffers misery for a long time, one who is killed or persecuted for trying to live in this abusive, abandoning, crushing, and excluding socioeconomic system. These 1,000 crosses of the contemporary martyrs bear witness not only to their drug overdose deaths, but to the uncounted deaths in the downtown east side, deaths of drug addicts from suicide and AIDS. And so we are all abandoned if one is abandoned. So we are all uncared for if one is not cared for. But if we would speak of real health and of true community, we must let these 1,000 crosses direct us toward those Aboriginal tribal communities and other real spiritual communities where when one individual behaved destructively, the entire community gathered and asked one question: what is wrong with us? What is wrong with us that this member of our community should behave in this way? But in our culture, we reserve this spiritual truth and blame the individual solely for his or her fate. And the perpetuation of this lie costs us heavily, costs us the lives these 1,000 crosses represent, costs us how many more thousands of lives, costs us in so many ways. And from this moment here in this community park, this park of great care, where the streets and alleys and hotel rooms of the downtown east side, the killing fields of the downtown east side, are transformed into living testimonies and memorials of those who have brought us together today. And Oppenheimer Park, where children play, birds sing, young people create, and seniors gather. These crosses are planted like seeds in our hearts. What will be the fruit these seeds bear? Will it be a stronger commitment to compassion and justice for every member of our community, a commitment to those most disabled, most abandoned, a commitment to do whatever is necessary to prevent 1,000 more deaths by drug overdose in the downtown east side. Will these 1,000 crosses, these 1,000 seeds, these 1,000 memorials burst forth into new life for those who will not have to become a martyr to our social madness around drug addiction, but will care burst forth in our hearts, in our lives, in a new way for the sake of others and for the sake of ourselves. I believe these crosses, these seeds are already bearing fruit. Hope stands right now, right here in this park at this moment. Hope is standing here. Hope in each cross. Hope in each of us. When these 1,000 crosses are planted in this park, who really see them are awakened, are called forth the community to care. And who really see these 1,000 crosses are called to be hope, soaring in the hearts of those for whom hope is gone, soaring in courage and blessing, as when eagles circle Oppenheimer Park.
Yeah, I have the same feeling every time I hear Bud Osborne recite anything, Isaac. But so I want to chat about what this movement was, but I want to give you an opportunity just to respond, to ask any questions that you have about, or was there a particular phrase that was important to you as you listened to it? I know his poems are always really, really long. But how did you hear that as you were sitting there at home listening to Bud Osborne standing with the seagulls in Oppenheimer Park? Yeah. Yeah, Isaac.
Yeah, that was incredibly powerful. That there was two kind of things that I wrote down that really stuck out to me. Was the one was the section about each, about the doctor saying, why are you still alive, and that each cross makes us all ask that, why are we still alive, and what can we do with the fact that we're still alive. And then the line, something, I don't know if it's exactly this, but what is that when something's wrong with a particular member of a community, the community gets together, specifically referring to Indigenous communities, what is wrong with us that a member of our community should act in this way? I just think there's so much that speaks to a lot of the things that I've been thinking about, and touches on kind of a book that I've been reading for a different class as well, called Relational Being, which is kind of the idea that we are all in relation to one another, even though we have such a strong view of individuality and a sense that we are all individuals, but that yeah. So I think that line's going to be sticking with me for a while, I think.
Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, I love that. I love both of those places in the poem for sure. Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you, Isaac. I appreciate what you shared, and those things resonated with me. I also would say that, like, when he was saying this sort of, and we're at the park and there's old people gathering here, and there are children playing, and there's 10,000 crosses, or 1,000 crosses, and there's 1,000 crosses. To me, that really spoke to the idea that oftentimes life moves on without the addicted, and so they're sort of stuck
Hmm.
in this perpetual state. And also that it is very enmeshed in day-to-day life in different ways. But also, to me, I mean, not to be super pessimistic, but it's again reiterated the idea that like this is repetitive. We've been saying this. We're saying this again. It's still here. It's still happening. Like, is it a broken record? Fine, because it's not changing, right? Like the idea of like still calling this out of the need and like sort of demanding change. And then I also kind of liked the seagulls because I was kind of looking to see if
Yeah.
I could see the crosses in the back, but being able to see the seagulls to me was a bit more hopeful. Like that's kind of a beautiful, like
Yeah.
sort of metaphor into itself as well. So I kind of liked that about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Seagulls everywhere. Seagulls and pigeons, the eternal birds. Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, there are could probably actually teach an entire course just on that poem, just in terms of just different pieces coming out of it in terms of framing a number of the things that it challenges a number of different ideas, and I hear the frustration in your voices as well. I hear that frustration. So this was something that started 30 years ago. So the opium crisis, like it is a long time. And as we talk about the movement and how it's continued and grown, it actually, there are more and more, always more to add, because it hasn't, the movement hasn't stopped the expenditure of life. Yeah. Thank you, Suzanne. What about others? One of my favorite Bud Osborne poems is called Amazingly Alive. And the thing that he keeps coming back to is this one line. And so pardon my language, but I actually think it's a very appropriate phrase. Fuck this North American culture of death. And and because it really is like in terms of looking at it from the perspective of all of the things that are part of like the reflection of the responsibility being on the individual and not on the community, and that there is something about this culture. And I could also talk a lot about our fascination with death, like how many cop shows and serial killer shows and all sorts of things, like this fascination that we have with death, but only some deaths, not all deaths, right? And people who fall, who are part of the communities that we're talking about today, it is those lives that don't attract a lot of attention. I saw a couple of things. Yeah. His book was race shit. Yeah, actually, that's a great book. I will totally I'm going to bring in a bunch of books, and if people want to borrow them, they're welcome to. This is I'll bring in some of Bud Osborne's books, but The Race Shit is actually a book that his work is in, but it's also just in general, just here are ways that we've changed the world and changed things that were happening. So yeah. And if I were ever to write a book, that would be the best title ever. But now it's already taken. And the success here, Nordy, is literally built on the deaths of others. So that line is understood. Yeah. So just in terms of talking about there we go. So 1997 was when the first crosses in Oppenheimer Park were out, and it was this idea of talking about them being the killing fields. And so that was now so 27 years, 28 years ago was the first time. This is something that happens every year in downtown East Side. And so this is is 2013, continuing to have the crosses and more crosses. So looking at representing the deaths that that have taken place as a result of opiates. And then by 2017, and this is a really important piece here, you'll notice that the way that this evolved was the idea that many people who are part of Indigenous community, there's a large Indigenous community in downtown East Vancouver, said, you know what, we actually want to move the church, and the idea of the crosses really for us is it represents that colonial violence, and so they changed it to being posts, and actually creating and naming each of the crosses as well. So turning it into community art that people could use to actually put names on. So as it has continued, they have been continuing, but it has evolved and it has changed. And I think for me, as I think about why has this particular installation and movement been something that has continued and grown and gotten much more press as well, is because it's something that was responding to the voices of the whole community, and they weren't stuck in one place thinking that this is something that works for everyone. Instead, voices of the community were represented. And so any questions about the movement, or any questions about this type of movement? I totally hear, Suzanne, you speaking to this idea that it's still happening now 28 years later, that there are voices that continue to be ignored. So why do we still, why is this still necessary? And if those were all the children of affluent members of society, because this is the piece that Bud Osborne talks a lot about, is that intersection with low income and with poverty. And I think about my work in Regent Park and being at a session in Regent Park where they were planning for the park, and hearing and having a woman stand up and say, everyone just needs to, and she made some profanities, but for very good reason, and just say, we wouldn't be having this conversation if any of us had money. And it was, and like, I just remember like having this feeling, like I was just like, oh God, did anyone else just feel like they got stabbed in the stomach right now? Like, that is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And it was all about this social planning that we were doing. And I just thought, oh, fuck. Like and so really that idea of power and privilege associated with money and access to resources is absolutely one of those things that has a profound impact on how effective and how this is being listened to in terms of a social movement, and in terms of something that is remembering lives, but whose lives? whose lives were those lives? Judith Butler wrote a number of books about precarious life, and just she's best known for her work around gender, but it was, to me, also a great book to read, as she talks about whose lives matter and whose lives matter to us, because at the bottom line, this actually impacts all of the decisions that we make as a society, that we make as individuals as well. Yeah, Suzanne.
Sorry, I could literally talk about this like, and I feel like I do talk about this a lot actually. And this is just the first time in this class. So like the thing that gets me also is that like is the second A in anonymous, right? For recovery, for a lot of people, like even if you don't know anything about recovery, most people know or at least have heard of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so
Yeah, sure.
there still is like that stigma, that shame piece, because I will tell you 100% that this like people are dying at every socioeconomic level. It's just they're doing it in private and it's not being reported. And I know someone who this month, her husband passed away from an overdose, and they are quite an affluent family, and the memorial just says died suddenly.
Yeah.
Right, even though we all knew, like that's the other thing, right? Like this is not, and like this is also the thing that comes into it as well, which is interesting around choosing to or not choosing to disclose, is that it's often after the disclosure of being in recovery that people then are treated differently, because you've said, hey, I have this label. But beforehand, even if you have incredibly maladaptive using habits, people are like, oh, that's just how it goes. And yet as soon as you stand up and say, actually, I'm this, then something shifts, something changes. And it's just, and so like where's the benefit in terms of disclosing too, right? And so I think that that's a really interesting notion, but like this is happening. People are like the fallacy that this doesn't happen if you have a certain amount of money in the bank is
absolutely
completely incorrect. It's just happening in private.
Yeah. And if you are not, if you don't have affluence, you have less capacity to hide what you are doing, what your habits are, what your addictions are, from others. Yeah. The idea of high functioning alcoholic, that somehow putting high functioning in front of alcoholic means that it's okay. Well, he's quite a high functioning alcoholic.
You're also not high functioning. You have money and you have people around you that are willing to support you on this. Like,
100%.
oh, it's Jay. Anyways, Nordy had his hand up too.
Yeah, Nordy.
Yeah, I was trying to hide out today in class because truth be told, a big part of this topic is very new to me, coming from a developing country. And it's also just very shocking to learn that something and somewhere like this exists in Canada, based again on the perception of Canada from the outside in. I had to call my best friend who lives in Alberta because he has lived there before me with his wife and two kids, and he told me that he actually went there. So I did what I normally do. I just did some checks beyond what was recommended for the readings and found some videos and movies and some other things. And the level of shock is so much that I've been actually just trying to figure out what I'm going to ask and what I'm going to say today, because I just see it as a geopolitical issue that has been left to fester. Geopolitical here meaning the physical location of East Side, Vancouver. And we haven't heard that yet, because I was trying to hold out to see if some of my questions would just be answered like you normally do throughout your lecture. But that connection to where it is being on the US border, I figure that's somewhere in the argument there in terms of the drug running. But then I had another question, which I put on the Padlet, but classmates, usual. So I was wondering, how is it that the other provinces have not, ended up with cities or areas like this one? And that led me to another assumption that there has to be some kind of common denominator that is maintaining this thing. I mean, this is a place that had, I think on record, one of the largest, they call it World Expo in 86. I even
Yeah.
made a brief mention of that on the Padlet, hoping the
Yeah.
classmates would pick up on that little pun there. But they had a world tour and they made billions of dollars. Why was this not turned back into the community to develop the community? Right? It also is an argument about displacement and how keeping people moving is a way of essentially keeping them confused, keeping them underdeveloped. Because during that same expo, they moved out people. The Japanese were there before, they moved out Japanese because of war issues. And then the people who settle there, they don't settle there for long. Of greatest embarrassment to me is that the government of Vancouver doesn't even have clear statistical data about the demography of Eastside Vancouver. So it shows me that there is some kind of political agenda to keep the place as it is. In my home country and in some African countries, there's a thing called tribal politics. We call it garrison politics, where you maintain the standard of certain communities because the less educated they are, it's easier for you to convince them to vote in your direction. Last week, I had a little debate with another of my professors, a sociology-based course, because he suggested, I was questioning something I continue to question. If the logic is that a developed country moves faster ahead if you have more people who are tertiary educated, why is it that governments underfund tertiary education? So I move that question over to East Side as well. If you know that when people don't have homes and they have these social ills, it's going to maintain the system, why not break it? But some of the answers you already provided, and I see the responsibility now, the argument of whether state is responsible, individual is responsible, it is just conveniently used. And I'm still in shock that for decades there essentially hasn't been any improvement. Some of the social projects, when in my other readings, they said 100% failure. I've never heard of social activities that have 100% failure, not even in my developing country. So it's a lot to think about. I'll pause there. I'll come back.
Yeah. Thanks, Nordy. I certainly downtown Eastside Vancouver is not the only place in Canada that where you would find a concentrated population of people who are experiencing challenges with housing. So there are areas in Toronto. So you have similar things happening in communities like Parkdale, with gentrification and the movement of people and just displacement of people in one of the communities in Hamilton. The Beasley community has one of the lowest incomes in all of Canada, because but they all have different makeups as well, right? So it's a lot of single men in Hamilton, and it was a result of the steel mills collapsing, and so that's why it was connected into that. But then you would also have and there's such histories within each of these areas as well. So you had a huge concentration, just like within US cities, where you have huge concentrations of low income communities that are racialized, that are connected into things like slavery. Or in downtown East Side, there's a connection between what happened with Indigenous communities and residential schools and just the violence that was experienced. So, I mean, I think that, but your point is well taken, that how can it be that the system, that you don't see huge improvements over the course of decades, where you just see increased vulnerability of populations. And that is with the engagement of the community. So I would say also that downtown East Vancouver, one of the things that was also in the materials was just talking about how the community has taken up nothing about us without us, because the downtown East Vancouver community was studied so often, and that idea of that drive-by researching, right, where there wasn't actually research that was actually benefiting them as well. So you've seen some really interesting things emerge out of that community, and yet it's never been enough to make a substantive change in the conditions, and the vulnerability to addiction and homelessness. I'm aware that we're talking about really heavy things and that you haven't had a break yet at all. I'm also aware that we started late. And so would people like to have a little bio break, and then we'll continue to have a conversation, but maybe stick your head out into the sun, or get a glass of water, or just have a bio break, whatever people need, and then we'll come back. We'll come back in another five. What do people need? 5-10 minutes? What would people prefer? Should we do 10? Perfect. We'll do 10. And I'll stick around.
A lot of things come up for me, Courtney, so thank you for those questions. But one of the things that, I mean, I do think I agree that, like, you know, we do have to ask those questions of who's letting that happen. I kind of think that part of it is because of how drug use is viewed in the public consciousness, similar to what Suzanne was saying, that there's such a stigma against it still to this day. And I think the public consciousness of drug use and has often, an addiction has been one of personal failing or of criminality. And I think that's such a pervasive opinion across the public that it's, you know, even if the public knows that these things are happening, it's almost like a way to justify it in their mind, or whereas I think what the harm reduction movement has been, I think why it's so important is because it is shifting the lens from that criminal perspective to one of public health, and one that is, and I think if enough people in the public consciousness shift their thinking into thinking it as one of public health rather than the kind of the criminality view that people are so common, that is so common, I think the more people will say to government, I hope, to governments in various places, we need to address this. You know, this is not being addressed properly.
Agreed. So here is one piece of the poem Race Shit by Bud Osborne. The whole one is 17 pages long, as poems can sometimes be, and I'll put the link in there as well. But I chose this chunk, which is the last chunk of it, because just in terms of thinking about what is possible and what is our responsibility as well. So this is, we resist because we are a community of prophets, of activists, of advocates, of volunteers and agency workers, and we, you and I, us, are all that stands between the unique, vulnerable, troubled, life-giving, and death-attacked community of the downtown East Side. We are all that stands between our vast community of thousands and those who would gentrify and displace and replace with greed, this singular leadership we have here, where it is said we lack a single dynamic individual leader, but have the most powerful leader there is, the most effective leader we can have in this grave situation. Our community itself has emerged as our leader. The downtown East Side community itself leads us, and it is to our credit that this is so, for it is from our prophetic, courageous, conflictual, and loving unity that our community raises shit and resists. And so just this, yeah. And so what I love about this poem is that it is looking at it's a strength-based perspective. It's looking at what the community has and what they can offer, as opposed to a completely deficit-based perspective. So this idea of, like, I don't think that we can see things that are going wrong, and we can respond to it, and we can help to raise shit, and we can advocate for, but it isn't a community that is without agency. And so I think that that's so important around any of these groups that we're talking about. And Nordy, I liked your story about the best jokes and the best advice and the best that these social movements have emerged out of incredible capacity and agency, whether it's out of desperation or out of hope. Communities are essential to any social movement. Yeah, Suzanne.
I was curious how come you didn't include anything from Gabor Mate in this conversation, just because this is, I mean, and it's maybe because, oh, this is one of the first classes I've been in where that hasn't been included, which is maybe why you chose not to include it. But I just see, I don't know. I was just curious as to if you could maybe give a little insight into that.
Oh, well, I'll tell you, I love Gabor Mate, and this course, as it was originally envisioned, was partnered with a course called Working with Survivors of Trauma. And in that, and I do think that it is a challenge to talk about, like, so Gabor Mate talks about violence and its impact and the trauma. And for those of you who don't know Gabor Mate's work, and maybe Suzanne, I need to include it, but then when you say that in every class that you're talking about, in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, is absolutely incredible. The myth of normal is even like just a more recent one that is really interesting as well. But I mean, Gabor Mate lived and worked in the downtown East, and it changed the way that he practiced as a doctor. And he has been incredibly impactful in the way that we understand violence and trauma and the impacts of trauma. And that course doesn't exist. It still exists. It's on the, it just, I have tried to get them to offer it again, but it is very interesting to read those two courses together. it's hard to look at, and yet impossible to look at it without. So it's hard to look at them together and to substantively put together a curriculum that's looking at a variety of different groups of people and social movements. But it is that resilience, and it is that agency, but that agency that grows out of the ways in which we are able to move outside of our trauma. So yeah, it's yeah, and that's
Can
maybe
I
something
just
for me to think more about. And maybe all of you need to also request that working with survivors of trauma be a course that's reinstated at OISE, because I think it is really important to read those two things together in terms of talking about systemically excluded and disenfranchised communities and the impact of violence.
And just to clarify, it's not that I have heard, keep reading it at OISE. It's just my background. Like, and so then I'm also recognizing, like, oh yeah, not everyone comes from my background. Shockingly enough,
Right.
community,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
community mental health, right? Like that's a very like that's
Yeah,
very
no,
in there, but not
100%.
like
Yeah.
at OISE necessarily. So, because I think
Okay.
also it branches into like trauma informed education, right? Like that kind
Yeah.
of like how are we educating people with an eye towards the fact that a lot of individuals carry trauma, and that being a human is a somewhat a traumatizing experience in the best
In
case scenario.
general,
So
in general, and more so in these days. Yeah, Suzanne, I really appreciate that feedback, and Isaac as well. Nordy, I think you would actually really appreciate these books. I'll tell you what, next week in class, I will bring a whole heck of a lot of books, because books are best when they are shared, and people are welcome to look through them. But and I'll bring some of Gabor Mate's books as well for people to look at. And I appreciate that feedback as well. This is yeah, it's impossible to separate the two of them. But it is just in terms of the piece of that raising shit and resisting is impossible to do if you are not on the road to healing, and moving outside of the impacts of that violence. Okay. Thank you so much. I always appreciate conversations in this class. So just from the perspective, and just kind of moving, we kind of over the break moved a little bit into just in terms of the conversation around sex trafficking and sex work, and just in terms of Hunt's work, there. It was only in 2007 in Canada that there was actually a differentiation between sex work and sexual exploitation. And now that's moved into the category of trafficking. And the Hunt article also talks about the number of acts of violence, particularly against Indigenous women, when you are talking about sexual exploitation and trafficking and conflating them into each other, is that there is a long history of sexual violence against Indigenous women. And although the term trafficking can really be used to frame all sex workers as victims, it's a very anti-prostitution and prohibitionist stance. And however, many different groups, for an example, would be Indigenous girls and women, experience sexual violence and exploitation and sex work differently than some of the conversation around the sex workers movement, and that has to do with a history. So, and that has to do with a colonial history in particular, I think, that has shaped the way that violence, and in particular sexual violence, has been practiced on the bodies of racialized women. And for those of you who are aware of or have never heard of before, the whole issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was something that also came out of the downtown East Side community of sex workers about in the 1990s about missing Indigenous women. And then the 2007 conviction of the serial killer that was related to the missing women. So we had a huge a serial killer who was taking people out of the downtown East Side, but because and I think it was Nordy who said this is an area that tends to be outside of our memory, that and where people are forgotten. So you can be forgotten in a place like the downtown East Side, except by the people who are part of that community. Not all missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls fall into the category of sex worker. In fact, only 10% of women actually fell into the category of sex worker, but all of the women who are murdered and missing, and part of that demographic, found themselves with limited options. There is I really encourage you, if you're interested in taking a look at some of the good work that has emerged out of the awareness of the vulnerability, in particular, of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And so there are a call to collaboration. This is aside from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to develop policies that address issues of prostitution and trafficking and sexual exploitation, focusing on the perpetrators that prevent abuse and ensuring that victims are not penalized and criminalized or have their personal autonomy restricted. The Reclaiming Power in Place is a great document to read, in particular about the recommendations. The Red Dress Project is another movement that has come out of the overrepresentation of Indigenous women experiencing different types of sexual violence. And so both of those fall outside of what we're going to talk about in terms of the sex workers' rights movements. And I will also say that there are a number of really profound recordings of stories within Canada of case after case after case after case of communities raising the alarm about a missing child, a missing mother, and our criminal justice system just not paying attention to that at all. And I'll bring some of those books next week if people are interested. Sex workers' rights movements are something, they do talk about prostitution as being one of the oldest professions. And the sex workers' rights movement is actually a movement that is taking back power from that that sense of being stigmatized by providing services that are highly in demand. And Norty gave a good illustration of his work with the Ministry of Health and the many different reasons why women might choose to engage in a career as a sex worker. Also, the differentiation of an escort versus a prostitute, and what is associated with both of those terms, and how we think differently. Even just in your own mind, if I say the word prostitute and I say the word escort, do you have a different picture in your mind? And that is around how we label people based on a word. And it is a very interesting thing to just even test yourself in terms of how you have been indoctrinated into thinking in a particular way. The sexual workers' rights movement the sex workers' rights movement is an active movement in many countries worldwide, which works to improve working conditions, increase benefits, eliminate discrimination on behalf of individuals working within the sex industry, whether it's legal or criminalized. And if you're interested, there's a list of sex trade workers organizations globally. About 25 years ago, I went to a conference, which was a community economic development conference, and I was working at the time with a group of women in Regent Park who were doing pre-apprenticeship programs, and one of the groups that I was on a panel with was actually a really interesting project at Simon Fraser University around sex workers' rights. And I got to meet with a number of these women, and I remember finding myself being absolutely astounded as these women told me about these international conferences for sex workers. So at the time, this was at the beginning of the first 10 years of the 2000s, where in Montreal, where there were literally thousands of sex workers from around the world who met for a conference on sex work. And I thought, say what? But this is not something that I had ever thought of before, that women who engage in sex work might actually be working in around labor rights and around providing better conditions for working. So one of the major things around sex worker rights and reform is actually the idea of decriminalizing sex work. And when you think about decriminalizing sex work, what would be some of the impacts of decriminalizing sex work? So would you think, as you're sitting here right now, what yeah, Suzanne?
Well, it moves it into the legal economy so that then your income can be used for things like to apply for a mortgage, or it becomes a valid, you're all of a sudden have gained a place within the economy of the country that can be important for people in terms of socioeconomic movement.
Right. Absolutely. So this idea that if you decriminalize sex work, what you're doing is actually considered legitimate, and it makes it safer for you if there are actually if you can actually have benefits to if you don't need to worry about saying what the work is that you are doing. The Bedford decision, which took place in 2013, there were actually 3 provisions in Canada's prostitution laws that criminalize sex work. And the court unanimously held that criminal laws prohibiting aspects of adult prostitution were unconstitutional because they violated sex workers' rights to the security of the person. And so harm reduction is also something that the sex workers' rights and some aspects of those campaigns would fall under harm reduction by the decriminalization of sex work. There is an organization, sex workers and Pivot provided an opportunity for sex workers even to know what their rights were. And so there are organizations that work alongside of sex workers and are part of sex worker reform, and have to do with educating people and also providing a differentiation between sex trafficking and sex exploitation, and sex work as well. And demand and supply arguments, it might become less attractive when it's legal. It is true, Nordy, that is possible. Sometimes we like, this is why, if they've done all sorts of studies about if something is illegal, it is more provocative, right? You get more of a rush from doing something that is illegal. But I would suspect, and in fact, I don't believe that there was a huge decrease in sex work following the decriminalization of sex work. So when we think about, this is an organization called Maggie's, and I'll share some additional resources for you after class today. But one of the things that they have done a lot of work on through the Toronto Sex Worker Action Project is labor rights actually equal a safety for sex workers, and that sex workers deserve labor rights, and decriminalizing sex work being a very important part of that conversation. Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project also did direct fundraising for sex workers that were impacted by COVID-19. And has challenged things like the City of Toronto's bylaws regulating adult entertainment venues like massage parlors and strip clubs, and challenging whorephobia and degrading comments towards sex workers in Toronto's media and political institutions. And so as much as doing direct work around protests, they are also working on a variety of different levels. They've also done things like organizing rallies, search parties, vigils, and memorials for sex workers who've gone missing or been murdered or experienced violence at the hands of local police. And as well as looking at other local movements and doing collaboration with migrant rights or with Black Lives Matter or anti-poverty organizing into direct work with sex workers. and then challenging bigotry within sex worker communities as well. And so having an awareness of the fact that there are many, many different people who form that community. Some of the things that were really significant around sex work in the age of COVID, and there were all sorts of things that I wouldn't have even thought of that Maggie's brought to light. So entrapping sex workers can't be a public health strategy. And there was actually, if you're interested in looking at some of the different campaigns that were part of COVID-19, there was a great lawyer, an ally and an accomplice who worked with Maggie's Toronto and put together an educational campaign and a resource guide around ensuring that sex workers weren't entrapped, and also ensuring that they were protected. And there was also work that was started during 2019 that looked at the barriers that Black sex workers experience, and that that intersection of race and work and sex work, and the impacts of that as well. There are a number of sex trade workers movements in Canada, and also an acknowledgement. Something that's really that's also significant is an organization called Butterfly, which is specifically looking at Asian and migrant sex workers network and the particular vulnerabilities that they experience as well. There was an interesting campaign around the fact that temporary foreign workers, if you are coming in as a temporary foreign worker to work as on a construction site, you have more rights than if you're coming in as a temporary foreign worker as an exotic dancer. So there are really interesting ways in which they become involved and put light into and expose the discriminatory pieces of legal movements as well. And then these are all different projects across Canada, and they are in a number of them you'll see are in Quebec as well. But every time that I look at the kinds of resources that are available and how extensive these networks are, I think to myself, I really don't have a really good idea of the extent to which sex work is integrated into each province, each community, and how much organizing both in Canada, in particular cities, and across the globe, how that has happened as well, to the extent that it is sex workers movement groups that have been very, very vocal as well when it comes to exploitation and trafficking. So as you think about, there are so many different resources to take a look at, although Suzanne, none of them are Gabor Mate's work, and it definitely is a very good thing to read with both of these groups of people. When you think about the idea of sex workers movements, is that something that when you read it as one of the populations that we were going to take a look at for the course, is that an area, would you have ever thought about sex work as, or sex work as actually having, as sex workers' rights as being a social movement? Is that something that was new to you, or is it something that you have heard about before? For how many people was the idea of sex workers' rights something that was new? Um, in terms of reading this, or in what context have you heard about sex workers' rights? Nordy, you shared that it was new for you, coming into Canada and thinking about it. New for you, not new.
Yeah, the rights part, the rights part of it is not new for me. There was an actual case. This is not the complete start, but there's an actual case in Jamaica where a man had agreed to have transactional sex with a woman, and he refused to pay, and she stabbed him and he died. So that initiated some support for sex workers at one point, because there was an argument about this issue of payment for services rendered. So it has actually come up in my home country too, about making it legal and taxation and all of that kind of thing. And it actually, there was a suggestion, they took it a step further. A tagline for Jamaica and many other Caribbean countries is sun, sand, and sea for our tourist market. Sun, sand, and sea. And someone suggested in many university classes that I've had back in Jamaica to add sex: sun, sand, sea, and sex. So it's 4 S's in the tourist product that we offer, because informally it is there. So why not just formalize it?
Okay, so it is something then that is really that Jamaica then is known for, that people would like. Was that the implication?
Yeah, it is a known part of our tourism product that people go to Jamaica for sex.
Okay,
It's just not formally recognized or advertised as a part of our tourist product, but it's known.
okay, so they decided not to offer sex directly as their tourism slogan. Yeah. Okay. What would have been, why not? So an interesting thing. So I kind of like this idea of why would people have voted that down?
Same thing we were talking about, stigma. Stigma. If you can't put it out there that you're selling sex, that co-modification thing of the body that I mentioned earlier, it's frowned upon in a lot of spaces, you know. And we can take it many ways. The whole colonial thing and the patriarchal structure of the society still dominates, where a woman's body especially. And I keep saying women, that I just want my classmates to understand, again, because of where I'm coming from and what's generally expected of sex workers, male sex workers. It isn't a big deal. So that's why, it's not a personal bias. So we wouldn't put sex out there because of how we want to be perceived. It seems all negative to say you're selling sex.
Yeah, for sure. and that is not, and there's a stigma on with that as well. Yeah, thank you, Nordy and Suzanne.
Well, just Nordy, while you're sharing, it's making me think about Amsterdam, right? Who's very that they're very public about the fact that that is a commodity there, and there it's very well known that that's a lot that and like legalized drug use, right? Like those are the two things that people are like, yeah, let's go to Amsterdam for that. My understanding is that sex work is highly regulated there, and but it also hasn't gotten rid of an underground market completely too. So Norty, to your earlier point about like, does it dilute the appeal if something is legalized, right? And but from other things that I have read in communities where they have not just decriminalized but actually legalized sex work, it cuts down on a lot of other illegal activity as well, right? So it's because sex work doesn't exist in a bubble. It's connected to a lot of other things. So it actually can raise the sort of community health and whatnot in general, by allowing for less opportunity to engage with black market or sort of the secondary economy. So I think that's interesting. But my understanding is that Amsterdam, they have really like the legislation about who can and when and where and how and who is very explicit, for lack of a better word. Like they're really they have that dialed in.
Yeah, and so there is, so they definitely make the differentiation between choosing sex work and trafficking and exploitation. So exploitation in Amsterdam is not allowed, legally granted. So exploitation, that's not at all what sex worker rights groups are doing in terms of doing like in terms of legalizing sex work. Would never involve exploitation. But there will always also there unfortunately, even if something is legalized, it won't necessarily stop exploitation and trafficking. And so what if? So I want to spend the last few minutes of class today thinking about what if. So what if we were given a mandate by the Canadian government? So we are a think tank hired by the next Prime Minister of Canada. Okay. And we've been asked to think about how we might change legislation and shift the stigma associated with drug use and sex work. So we've been asked to do this. I have a couple of questions. One is, what steps should we take? What challenges would we face? Can we be successful with this task assigned us by the Prime Minister? I'm not going to name the Prime Minister right now, just because I'm not going to speak any intentions into this world, though I hope it is not. I don't think it would be, Polyev would not be the Prime Minister who would invite us to do this. So there is a Prime Minister who actually would like to would like to actually change the to change the criminalization of shift criminalization of drug use, and then create and reduce stigma associated with addiction. And sex work. Okay, so our job is to shift the criminalization of drug use and reduce stigma associated with addiction and sex work. What steps would we take? Now, we can have long-term and short-term. And what challenges would we face? What are the biggest challenges? So we've talked about a lot of different challenges. And I'm choosing all of Canada. I'm not going to just say Ontario. Let's dream big. I don't think that Doug Ford would assign us this work either. But we can be hopeful. And what challenges we face, and is it possible to be successful with a task like this? We've been given 25 years to do this. Okay, so we got 25 years to make these changes, right? Because 25 years is when the whistle was blown on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in downtown Eastside Vancouver, as well as the opioid crisis, right? So we can take at least 25 years because we haven't seen very much happen with those current campaigns. But so what would we do? What are some things that you would do? You could start with what challenges? Shall we start with the challenges? Get those out of the way. What kinds of challenges are we going to face? Yeah, Chris.
In terms of challenges, nobody's going to fund you.
No, but the government's funding us.
Oh, they are. Okay.
The government's funding us. Yeah. Okay. So the government's going to fund us. I'm not saying it's going to be enough, but so we could say not enough funding. Because what if another prime minister comes in? Not enough funding. We have 25 consistency of government over 25 years. Okay. Okay. And Nordy, I want to start with the negatives and end with the positives. Great. Challenges with who we are. Our background as educated people may be a hindrance to our goals. Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Because educated does not mean open-minded. We have been educated in a particular way. I think we would be asking why we aren't promoting formal education rather than decriminalizing an area that we may not personally be a part of. All right. So Nordy, next time we'll talk about better funding for education. Today, this is just, but that makes sense. This would be coming in from the public. In essence, we would be seen as hypocrites promoting what we would not want for ourselves and our families. Interesting. If we share personal narratives with the issues. Okay, so our biggest challenge is going to be ourselves. Why this is important to us as a country. Okay. All right, Suzanne, and then Isaac.
The number one challenge that I would see, it was sort of like what Chris was saying about the idea that it's not funded. I think linked to that, say it is funded. I think as soon as our tax dollars are at work on this, the expectation from the general public is going to be huge in terms of what it is. And so I think one of the first things I would want to do on a committee like this would be to really define what success looks like so that we're all on the same page, knowing like that like there's like you said, there could be short-term and long-term goals, and there would have to be room for individualization across the country.
Okay. And individualization across the country. Love it. Okay. All right, Isaac.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major challenges would be kind of the public perception of both of those things that I was kind of referring to earlier in my comments, and how to change that public perception, especially with a good chunk of the country being more socially conservative, especially with a lot of Canada's Protestant background in a lot of areas. I think there would be a challenge there, and I'm thinking of like we would need some sort of PSA that calls back to that egg cracking video, but like this is your brain on conservative values or something. I don't know, something like that. But I think that would be one of the hardest things
Okay.
is to change the public perception. But I think that is already happening. So we can go with the things that haven't worked.
No, I think, no, you're right. This is your brain on conservative values. It is interesting. It is interesting why things matter to people. Chris, thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, brilliant. One growing challenge, even if we intervene in the current generation, what I observe, even as daily people die, for example, from substance use, there is always ongoing trauma, and particularly like in my experience, like half my life dedicated to addressing violence and working with those who identify as men around healing childhood sexual abuse, like the trauma that is derived from childhood sexual abuse. As long as that is going on, like there will always be people who need to escape, like that one trauma in particular just comes up so often. And and so as long as that is happening, and we could intervene in this generation, but there's going to be every day new people who are struggling with substance use, who are working in the sex trade, and I mean both, I mean all genders. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a challenge. It's just that we never actually can address the problem within one generation, because as long as there are always new traumas, and some of those people perpetrating trauma, perpetrating harm upon others, there will always be this population of people who are living on the margins.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was hoping that we were going to actually get a total solution by the end of class. So this is a little bit disappointing to me, Chris, that it'll be hard for us to get there. But no, I think these are all really legitimate, all such important and legitimate points, and you see the complexity of shifting and moving into a new space when it took us a long time to get here, and so that the changes are can be really slow to come as well. Yeah, Suzanne.
To me, also, both of these campaigns, I'm going to flip into solutions for a second, if that's okay. Is better funding for like ODSP and Ontario Works. These are not exclusive to poverty, but are exacerbated by poverty. And so I think a place where we could make some inroads on that would be to make both of those systems more functional, essentially.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Suzanne, that's great. And Nordy, to your point as well, like thinking about, can we actually provide education for people and invest in our education system, right? Like that would have an impact as well. Yeah, Chris.
I know I've spoken a lot today, but the last 3 weeks have, been really engaging subjects to me. To take again, I some exposure to like right-wing thinkers, and so borrowing from their playbook, which is full of manipulation and coercion and persuasion, but they acknowledge the value in uh, appealing to the interests of others, and so I think one thing that you could do is demonstrate how these people will become taxpayers and how that will generate revenue, and that it's this untapped market, and so for right-wing thinkers, I see that they use that principle of appeal to the interests. So if you want to get something done and demonstrate success, appeal to people's interests, right? And I think people, it's hard to argue with taxation and new diverse you know businesses to invest in, and all of those things.
Yeah. Absolutely. I really appreciate that as well. I won't tell you about, I saw a very interesting, ad the other day. And I started thinking about the investment that was in that ad, and I'll share it with you guys after class on the announcement page when we got more things. But we only have a few minutes to solve this issue, and so I'm hoping that Isaac has the final word on how we're gonna get this done in 25 years.
That's a lot of in
No,
2 minutes.
I'm
We'll see what
just
I can do.
joking.
Chris, I think that's such a good point about kind of the
Yeah.
people that have more conservatively economic conservative views and values on this. I mean, there was I went to a friend's birthday, and his parents are from Barrie, and Barrie is dealing with homelessness and addiction challenges as well. And his parents were very conservative, and they found out what I did, and they were like, so how do you solve these problems, right? Kind of having this conversation, but it was really eye-opening for me in a lot of ways, and hopefully for them, just for what their thinking is. And I talked about how even if people are at the place where they want hello. Even if people are at the place where they want to access addiction care or mental health care, that there just isn't. There's so many hurdles to get access to that care. And he said, this very conservative father of my friend was like, if there was a huge chunk of money that was to make to offer people more health care, more mental health care, more addiction things, that's something I could get behind if that's what it takes. And I was really shocked to hear that in a way, but I think you're so right, like to be able to convince the naysayers that there's economic value to these economic benefits to these changes. So, great point, Chris.
Yeah, that's interesting too. You should have had him take his checkbook out at that very moment. Yeah. And I mean, these are all of these things. So I appreciate, first of all, truth be told, I didn't think that we were gonna get to the end of the solution for all solutions, but I also think that it does take time, and that every single one of us working in the in a couple of, like we talked about, and I'll pose this question to you in a couple of weeks time, and you could be thinking about it, is like, how can you fund the revolution, right? So I'm not sure that I have the complete answer to that question, but I do think that change needs to happen on so many different levels, and it can feel frustrating to look at, and so many of you have talked about this today, frustrating to look at some of the historic perspectives on harm reduction movements and sex worker movements, and to see how little the thermometer has moved, right? And in fact, it seems to be maybe even getting worse. So there are more overdose deaths. And so what does that mean? Does it mean that good work hasn't been done? And I think that as we think about all of the different forces and structures that contribute to some of the things that we've talked about, from mental health to economy, to stigma attached to, like, all of the different systems, to environment, right? Like all of these different pieces, that it does take time for change to happen. But if all of these things, it would actually be an exercise in horror to think about what might have happened if all of those people that we've talked about had not stood up and pushed back against the deterioration of community. And so I think it's important to hold all of these things as we think about being allies, accomplices, people with lived experience, all of these different pieces, is that there is so much value to the work that we've been talking about. I do think that we need to be very strategic. I do think that we need to work smart, and that collaborations are important. And you all talked about how all of these pieces have so many different layers and so many different interwoven pieces, from historic to current to economy to mental health. And how do we move forward? How do we as members of communities in Canada, how do we actually say that this is what needs to happen, and this is where money needs to be invested? I don't think that we always think about, I don't think one of the things that could be more effective is how we push back. And so I won't promise that we're going to get to the end of the semester and that we're going to have a complete answer about how we're going to change things. But I do promise that if you continue to ask questions and can focus on one small project, right? And you have an assignment, just a little proposal assignment that is due to me on Friday. And that's one of the things that, as we're looking at all of these systemic issues and social movements that are positioned, the idea of being able to, there is a method to my madness of being able to focus on one small piece, because it takes a whole bunch of small pieces to have an impact. And even small little puppet shows and puppets and all of those things can be contributing to change on different levels. Are there any resources that speak to the relationship between the physical location of the downtown east side and the social issues there? Nordy, yes. And so it would be the physical location, but then I also think that you have to like that there's a historic piece that is connected into that as well. And so I will. I'm always interested in kind of trying to piece together how these different pieces come together. But I think that there are, and I will look for something that would provide that as well. I will also, you'll notice that as we have different topics that we're looking at, I will give you many, many different resources. And I don't have an expectation that, so if I follow up with like, 20 extra articles that you could look at, it's because maybe this is an article that as you are thinking about your own project or something that piqued your interest, that this is something that you can take a look at as well. And Suzanne, that is fantastic. I would love that. And please, I am so happy to share with the group any resources that people have. And I will bring a nice big bag of books with me. And I've confirmed with Hetty and with Amelia that they're joining us next week to talk about people who are unhoused and homelessness next week. And we are back in person or in our high flex method. And Hetty has a few questions that she wants you to consider. And I'll post those on the announcement page as well. Yeah, Suzanne.
Quick question is just, are we still able to use this as a reflection opportunity for one of the other
100%,
assignments?
100%.
Okay.
Yeah. So I did, I'm hoping that Destiny will be able to come and at least you'll have a chance to meet her. But I did have permission to put the video on and to share the resource and any of the resources that we're talking about as well. So you can still absolutely use it. And I will look forward to your reflection papers. You guys can feel free to reach out to me about anything with the assignments. And please also know, if you find that you're losing sleep over putting your proposal together, then please reach out to me and say, Bethany, I'm losing sleep over this. I promise that this is only to get you to not lose sleep in the future weeks when you need to actually put something together, but that if you have done everything that I've asked you to do, just answered those questions, you're going to get the grade, right? So like this is a process-based piece. And so please don't worry, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail what Bethany's asking me to do, because this is what we do this is what we've learned to do in an education system, right? Like, but please know that if I think that you've totally missed the mark, I will contact you and say, hey, can we have a conversation about this before I enter any grade? So please know that this is only the beginning of a conversation in terms of what you are submitting to me on Friday. Okay. All right. And do reach out to me if there is if you are losing sleep, because I don't want you to lose sleep at all. It's another couple of weeks before you get to be off for your reading week, and and so anyway, thank you. Oh yeah, Juliana.
Sorry, super last minute question.
Oh yeah.
I was having a hard time finding the form on Canvas, like on Quirkus.
Huh.
I was just wondering if you could just if I can just check where I should find it, because I know I clicked on the actual assignment page and then I couldn't find the link there. So I'm
Okay,
just wondering if it's
so you'll be able to find them on the announcements. I've posted it a couple of times. But
Oh,
I will, because someone had told me that they couldn't find it, I will make sure that it's in the that's in the announcement. I'll make sure that it's in the assignment box, and just the announcements should, but I will also I'll just actually put it into the chat right now, so that everyone has this. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And sorry for not for it being difficult to find. Sometimes the Quercus is kind of like a little bit of a rabbit hole. So I apologize for that. Oh, and I actually just sent Kiana the article, no one else. Sometimes that happens in Zoom. So I'm gonna now put the actual thing here for everyone to see. All right, there we go. So there you go, if you want to download it, but I'll make sure and I'll put it again in the in the chat as well. Yeah, and having said that, I wish you all a wonderful week, and